Every time I get introduced, I hear that and I say, who are they talking about? Are they talking about me? My goodness, that just sounds, you don't tend to think of the accomplishments of your life, but thank you so much for that. That was very gracious, Heidi. So, yes, I am super privileged to be here. What a wonderful country you all have. This is my first trip to Jamaica, and I don't know why that is. It's a big world, and we sometimes just sort of don't get to the places that are right next to us. I come from the United States. I come from Boston, Massachusetts, where we will get a foot of snow tomorrow. So I am indeed happy to be here, not just because of that, but because you have a wonderful country. And I can sense, even though I've only been here a short time, the amazing volunteer spirit that is here in the community. You all have such an amazing culture of volunteering, and I'm just delighted to be here to share it with you. And I am also privileged to be, if what Bobby says is in fact true, the first international visitor to join you, and may our ranks open now, and may the world kind of come back to where we all want it to be in a more easily gatherable places. So let me just say also, there are events that are happening in this world right now that are grave. And I just want to remind us that volunteering has always been and will always be the fastest pathway to peace. And as volunteers, you know that, as Heidi said, when you volunteer, you do not see differences, you see similarities. So as the world outside these doors goes through trying times, I want you to hold that, and I want you to remember the power of volunteerism to create and sustain peace. So let me offer my thanks, of course, to CVSS for all of your leadership. To Heidi, thank you for those wonderful remarks, but thank you so much for the commitment of the private sector and all of the sponsors to this very important issue. To Butch and to Safri, congratulations on leading this organization during this time, a time that has seen 95,000 beneficiaries and over 30,000 volunteer hours. I think we need to give them an incredible hand for that. All right, now let's begin. I'm going to talk a little bit about my organization because I think it's going to be relevant to the topic at hand, this research that we've conducted. And I will have to say that listening to Safri, I was both delighted and saddened because what Safri described has happened in every country around the globe. My organization is privileged to work with CVSSs all around the world, organizations who are devoted to volunteering in their country. And what Safri described, you're going to see happened everywhere. The challenges, but also the innovation, right? So again, it's wonderful to have that kind of collective experience, but also a little bit challenging in that we do have significant issues ahead of us. All right, but I'd like to begin. Perfect, excellent. Whenever I talk about volunteering during COVID-19, and I'm sorry if you can't see that, you folks over there, but I like to show this slide. What this slide is it's a picture of volunteerism in Eastern China in the first days of the COVID-19 pandemic. And basically, at the far left hand of that graph, it shows, and you can get a copy of this. I'll be more than happy to share a copy of this so you don't have to necessarily squint to read it. I'll tell you that in January of 2020, of the 20,000 volunteers that were in Eastern China, 9 of them were COVID related. Oh, excuse me. But up at the top, that second red circle, as the pandemic worsened and as the need grew, so did the volunteer response. The volunteer response is the red line. The blue line is other volunteers. Basically, as the threat and the pandemic grew, so did the response. And I want you to remember that time and the chaos and fear of that time. And yet, you had, at the peak of the pandemic, 20,000 COVID-related volunteers a day stepping up to respond in that community and to help the people despite their own welfare. Because remember, we didn't have a lot of information and there was no vaccine at that particular time. And yet these volunteers deployed and redeployed to help people in need. And I say, this graph shows what Ayami, my organization, believes, that the COVID-19 pandemic has emphasized how volunteers are practical agents of change, delivering resilience in their communities and being very much a part of the civil society in their communities, regions, and countries. Okay, a little bit of Ayami's mission. Ayami creates a more just and sustainable world by enabling leaders, organizations, and environments that empower volunteers. That is our mission statement. We do it through advocacy, and by that I mean creating an enabling environment for volunteers to be successful. We must always remember that volunteering around the globe is not always celebrated. In fact, it is considered a threat in many areas because of its propensity to raise awareness of systemic issues. So Ayami's significant role is to make sure wherever we can, we are creating an enabling environment that allows people to volunteer and do so safely. We also practice knowledge development so that we are raising the awareness of the role volunteering plays in a global society. We were talking about this yesterday on the visit to the Peace Corps. It is my belief that volunteering isn't valued for the imperative that it is today. That you often, as I describe it, feel a pat on the head, you know, when you tell somebody you're a volunteer. When what the reaction should be is, thank you. You're an amazing part of what keeps our society well and healthy, and thank you for your services. That often doesn't happen. So Ayami's work is to create that global narrative, and I would say it's the job of each and every one of us to sustain and create a narrative that sees volunteering as the essential part of any community, any country, any region. We also develop leadership networks because we believe that leadership, just as CVSS, in corporates, in civil society, is the best way to train, enable, and create what we like to refer to as catalytic volunteering. We have two leadership networks. We have a global corporate network, which is made up of global corporations who really prize employee volunteering. And we have a global network of volunteer leaders. So that's organizations, 157 of them all across the world, just like CVSS, organizations that are building and looking after volunteering in their country. I like to show this slide because it seems like it's, it makes me look a little smarter than I am. But basically what this says is we're not just talking about leaders. We're talking about networks of leaders, just the way you are a network of leaders here in Jamaica. This is a slide called Metcalfe's Law. It's from the internet. We basically, the way I translate it is this. The number of people who use a network or who are engaged in an issue, the greater that effort becomes. And that's why networks of leaders are so important to Ayami, because by creating the places and spaces just like this, where volunteers and volunteer leaders can come together, we create that global narrative. We feel less isolated, we learn and share, and we realize that together we're creating a statement about the value of volunteering in our communities, but also globally. Okay, so what I'm really here to talk about is this research that we did. And we completed it, we started it during COVID-19 in June of 2020. And we wanted to find out what the CVSSs of the world were doing during this pandemic. how were they behaving? What challenges were they facing? And where was the innovation? Just like all the things that Safri has just told us, we wanted to find out that from across the globe. We interviewed over 67 of these organizations in interview. We also surveyed well over 125. So what you see is a compilation, and that very much of a global footprint. We call it disruptive innovation that occurred because of, certainly there was COVID-19, but we must always remember that we are in a climate crisis as well. That only ever exacerbates what the pandemic happened. And of course, global inequality and structures of inequality that just compound everything that COVID-19 brought. So what we found, again, was just what we've already heard from today. And again, I'm not going to make you read this, but I'm just going to pick out a couple of phrases. This notion of, from the Peruvian experience, just sad, exhausted, depleted, one volunteer said. From the African experience, the lack of systemic health care only exacerbated this. And of course, from the Hong Kong experience, right away, suddenly we were plunged into an international stage 1 high emergency alert. This is just an understanding of, again, those initial days, and we all have our own particular memory and way of describing them. But it really just says that all of a sudden we were going about our business and conducting our lives, and all of a sudden everything changed, and we had to pivot. That word that we've all used over and over again. We had to figure out how to do our business, but do it in whole new ways. What the research found is that these organizations did just that, and they became that center circle. They became transformative leaders. So not just leaders who went about their business and got things done, but took the COVID-19 experience as an opportunity to transform what they were already doing. They started with a culture of collaboration. This is something that we've heard Safri talk about. They reached out and they realized that the best way to get things done would be working collaboratively. They conducted what we call values-driven advocacy. While they were going about their work, they saw things, systemic issues that they knew they wanted to address. And instead of sort of putting their blinders on, they went ahead and addressed those. And I'm going to go through each of these a little bit more detail. Of course, they supported and developed others. That's what volunteers do. They showcased incredible creativity and innovation. So they found out how to do things that they could no longer do, but they needed to do, so they did them in a different way. And finally, they led change. Let's start a little bit on that culture of collaboration. What this basically says is that volunteer leadership organizations really reached out and dug deep and increased that cross-sectoral collaboration. So working with development agencies, working with other social welfare organizations that they had not worked with before. And they also educated decision makers. You can see there that 64% reported an increased cooperation with government, and 52% reported an increased participation and partnership with the private sector. This is an increase over what they had been doing. Something about the COVID experience caused them to reach out and caused them to formulate these partnerships that ended up being incredibly fruitful, particularly with the private sector and with government. The volunteers, they reported building bridges that they hadn't been able to build before, brokering relationships between government, between the private sector, to really help develop the development of their stakeholders. That they felt like they were enabled and felt empowered in their own development. And that this last one, the partnering with companies, governments, volunteers really ensured outcomes that were based on community needs. And that real sense of helping to develop a culture of participatory governance in volunteering. Our research found these organizations during COVID-19 really developed what we call values-driven advocacy. So it created a momentum, COVID-19, to really understand and showcase the work of volunteers. So as I mentioned before, we're not really at a point where people understand or appreciate the value or role of volunteering. But COVID-19 changed that. Governments, private sector, all sorts of stakeholders suddenly looked to local volunteer organizations, and many of them became the go-to for volunteering. Where had previously been the case where international sending organizations had always taken the lead, because of those safeguarding issues and the prevention of those international volunteers, many of these local volunteer organizations for the first time got the attention of their own governments. And it was like, oh, you're here. You're here all along, and you've been here all along. And that was a game changer for them. Having had that, they used it to really build their power and influence in some pretty remarkable ways, and to become a catalyst for advocacy. So having been recognized by their governments, they then said, if you want us here, if we're of value, we need to do things that protect our volunteers and safeguard our volunteers. We need you to understand that volunteerism is never free. It may be, as Paul Sully said yesterday, there's always a cost somewhere. So we need you, government, to start to invest in this. And they finally had their ears because of the way they had responded. All right, advocating for inclusiveness became super important for these people. Right? These barriers were always here, right? There have always been some people who we appreciate as volunteers and others less so, right? People for whom we encourage and dissuade from being volunteers. These organizations around the globe took COVID-19 as an opportunity to correct that. And when you think about that, we're talking about, in this case, senior citizens who suddenly were told they could not volunteer. We're talking about informal volunteering, which is the volunteering that occurs every single day that had never been taken into account. Suddenly, people started to recognize that. What we call episodic or micro volunteering, right? This trend that people no longer want to sign up for one organization Mondays from 3 to 5 every week. No, they want to think about, listen, I have a free hour, or I can make some calls. That type of volunteering had always been considered less than a traditional formal volunteering. But the COVID-19 experience took all that away, and they started to understand a much broader sense of volunteering and the inequalities in the treatment between national and international volunteers. As I like to say, this is not an either or, it is a yes and, right? There are parts to play for both domestic volunteer organizations and internationals. But this is about how that relationship works and about a greater equity and a greater share of voice for the local organizations, because there will be a next pandemic. There will be a climate crisis. There will be something. And why not build the infrastructure right in your very backyard that can sustain that and create that resiliency? They supported and developed others to a much greater degree. Again, we should not be surprised. These are volunteer leaders after all, and it is what they do. But they really looked at that safety issue and the safety of people coming out. And it was an interesting time for volunteering. Never had the need been greater, but either never had the risk been greater as well. So these organizations had to navigate that. And they made sure that they were putting in place safeguarding policies, and that they were advocating up to governments, private sector, to really make sure that these policies were understood, appreciated, and embedded into volunteer service. They improved quality standards. And they really, again, that growth in community-based volunteering, because it was close, because those relationships were already on the ground, and because they could deploy that in safer and more rapid ways. New opportunities going forward, these organizations said technology will be a part of what they do, right? And we'll get to a little bit about that later. But so will also 73% set a greater emphasis on those community-based systems and creating new opportunities to capacity build through the COVID-19 experience brought that. Showcasing innovation, I don't think anybody will be surprised at this either. When you're thrown into a situation and you simply have to adapt, right? These organizations displayed enormous adaptive capacity. Volunteering did not stop, as you all know. We just had to figure out different ways to do it. And this, as you can see, 64% said they moved to online volunteering. So globally, 64% of the organizations like CVSS couldn't do face-to-face, and so they very, very quickly moved straight into digital. But, you know, it was viewed as more accessible to some, but we should always know that that is not the full answer. Because of access and because of a digital divide, digital cannot be the only answer to this. It cannot be the only solution. And also just the fact that people want to be with one another. They'll always want to volunteer together. So while technology is a solution, it's not the only solution, right? Greater emphasis, again, on mobilizing those community-based volunteers and a greater emphasis on youth. Many of the organizations we spoke to hadn't really engaged youth as much. They had really relied on the other end of the population, people who had been retired and who had more work flexibility. But because of those safeguarding issues, that population was at greater risk. And so the youth really came to the forefront and were seen, at least in those early days, as being less vulnerable to COVID-19. Many of those organizations really embraced that and really said that that will always be a part now of their volunteer program. Again, digital, they adapted to digital, but felt, you know, this is not an easy sort of situation for them. They adapted, but technology issues are not always accessible. Some had really great funding success. They reached out. The private sector, we have seen, has been enormously helpful in this situation globally, with many companies just saying, here's some funds. You don't need to worry about reporting, just respond with this, and being very generous. However, not all, and certainly this notion of not really being, you're so busy responding that you're not really able to think about resourcing your organization. And then also this restructuring activities, that word pivot, but that really takes a lot of time, and that really takes a lot of effort. So while the adaptation is good, it didn't come without its challenges and complexities. And we always have to remember that, again, these people led through all of this complexity and still sort of adapted and innovated. Okay, fine. Last one is leading change. And, you know, I like to think of this as, yeah, these people, again, volunteering didn't stop. They led, but they took the opportunity to become transformational leaders, right? So when they saw issues that in some cases had always been there, they decided this was the opportunity. As you know, Paul and I talked about yesterday, Winston Churchill, we believe's quote, never let a good tragedy, I think it is, never let a good tragedy go to waste. These leaders took that. They took that and they said, we're going to change some systemic issues that we've always known has been here, and we're going to do that. And I think you've seen that ripple across sectors, you know, government, private sector. People are in many ways using COVID-19 to make some changes that they've always wanted to make. This notion of collaboration, right? We're not going to get through this alone. We need it to be cross-sectoral, and we need it to be deep collaboration. And this notion of inclusion, right? Now's the time to make sure that we're creating an enabling environment for everyone to volunteer. Because while everyone may not describe themselves as a volunteer, I can guarantee you everyone wants to make a difference. Everyone wants to matter to their families, to their communities, to their countries. All right, let me just pause here and talk a little bit about the corporate response, because I think that is so important. We have another study that's coming out in April. Companies are just around the corporate response to COVID-19, but I want to just highlight some of our early findings there. Companies demonstrated an enormous ability to respond quickly and creatively. Many set up funds, and again, they were very generous in both finances and in spirit, allowing that people didn't necessarily have time to fill out reports or develop proposals. The need was that great. And the private sector responded enormously. I think Safri has mentioned that as well. Volunteering for the private sector became closer to home. So, where there had been cross-border or even cross-regional, cross-country, it really, because of safeguarding, became volunteering that was closer to home. And in many ways, that was really great because it allowed them to understand the issues that we talk about, or they may read about in the media every day. They understood that those issues were playing out right in their own backyard. And that became an incredibly important finding. That the balance in a destabilized world, people wanted to do something, and employees globally rose up, and there was a surge in employees volunteering, particularly in those first days of the pandemic. Now, that didn't necessarily last, I'll get to that, but there was a robust response. And again, what happened from the private sector at the leadership C-suite level is many executives understood corporate volunteering for the first time during this period, which was a really, it was a good benefit. It was a great thing to come out of that surge in volunteering. And finally, they globally saw a growth of employees who had never volunteered before, because they didn't see themselves as a volunteer, but suddenly the combination of both digital and the combination of need really rose up. Some challenges. Difficult to volunteer virtually, just as it's difficult for anyone sometimes to volunteer and access or digital consistent access. It was also difficult for corporations and employees to volunteer digitally. And technology, certainly proved to be that barrier. Also, companies use volunteering as team building, and without that kind of space, they were a little bit at sea in terms of how to run these programs. There've been some really great innovation with that. Companies who are thinking are really moving into how do we do team building virtually. But again, in that first 6 months, year, it was a lot of confusion about how do we do team building. People want to come back from their employee volunteering experience and talk about it. And there were no real mechanisms to do that. Again, recognition. Certainly not all employees volunteer to be recognized, but it's certainly nice when that happens. And that recognition was not really an easy process to do virtually. And finally, I think we've all felt this, but the Zoom fatigue. Being online all day and then having to log on after work and do volunteering. Many people had the best of intentions. And again, that's why you saw that Zoom, that's why you saw that really zoom up in the first days. But after a while, it just hit us all. And, that was their virtual volunteering was the first thing to go. So I wanted to, we can talk a lot more about that, but I just wanted to highlight some of the early findings of that piece of research. So again, to sum, what they told us volunteering would be in the future, it would be more inclusive in the future. Again, we're not going to let go these things that we've found, these barriers, the fact that some people can volunteer and some people can't. We had a very interesting conversation yesterday about how do you really do that? How do and how do you really make that systemic change? And looking at your volunteer programs to make sure that they're accessible to all, that maybe they're in places in communities rather than needing to take a bus ride to those communities. Lots of different ways to do that, but it is imperative, and it's incumbent upon us all to make sure that we're doing that. That we will be more local in our volunteering, that we will place a premium on the CVSSs of the world, which is great for Ayami because that's what we do. We're going to understand that international volunteering is, of course, a wonderful thing to do, but the infrastructure that we build in that country made up of those citizens, the people who were there before and will continue to be there, is the best thing we can do for volunteering resiliency. That we will be digital, not, again, lots of stuff, but it's incumbent upon us to make sure that access is there. And then finally, we will make sure that we are reaching out broadly in partnerships and coalitions. All right, Just quickly before I go, Ayave's World Volunteer Conference, and I'll make sure you have all of our, our website, all of this up on our web. We have a volunteer conference the 24th through the 27th. I certainly hope someone from CVSS will be here and join us in that. We have a Global Youth Summit in July of 2023 in Edmonton, Alberta. Again, we'll have our corporate research out in April, and Ayami is working on what it's calling a new universal declaration on volunteering, which we'd love to have global support for. It's a statement that really attests to the value of volunteering and to the role it plays in creating and sustaining societies. So thank you so much, and I certainly appreciate your invitation, your time, and your hospitality.